own 12th grader, Hazal Kara. Hazal has been a member of the digital branch of Fridays for Future, as well as for Youth for Climate, where she has helped to increase public awareness of the climate crisis in Turkey. Most recently, she spent 2 weeks in Glasgow at the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference as a youth observer. Welcome, Louisa. We're thankful to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be joining you. I have to tell you, I'm joining you from a car in a parking lot somewhere between Gebze and Ankara. So I think everything should be under control, technologically speaking, but if I suddenly disappear, I will come back as soon as I can. And thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
So do I have the green light to speak?
Absolutely.
You're waiting for me. Okay, thank you so much. And just let me first of all commend the school on your very clear attachment to sustainability as a principle and the Sustainable Development Goals as relevant targets for your, not just your studies, but I think for the lives of your students. And also to say how impressed I am at the engagement of your students and at the example, the colleague who is speaking here today, Hazal Kara, as an activist, really with very substantial achievements, and for your attendance at the COP26. And I wasn't there, obviously, so you have the fresher impression, so I'm very keen to hear your insights. But in spending the next 15 to 20 minutes with you, and really thank you for the opportunity to share my views, I wanted to talk a little bit about sustainability as an issue, about what the UN does broadly, but more specifically on sustainability, and then to come back to the COP26 climate summit, the Glasgow climate summit that we've just seen concluded, really to talk there about, are we doomed or do we have a future? Because I think the issues on the table are really that serious. And they are very much, we use this language of intergenerational solidarity or intergenerational challenge, but really the question is that are adults today going to be so selfish that they deny the chance of a future with a healthy planet for the generations of tomorrow? And really that's for your generation of emerging to adulthood now. So really just a couple of opening remarks, and then I would welcome your questions, and I'm keen to listen to Hazal's insights. But on sustainability, the idea of what are the ingredients of human well-being have changed over time. And I know that just from the short time that in my career at the United Nations Development Program, that even when I started, which was not so long ago, but long enough ago in 2004, the focus was on human development. Now the focus is very much on sustainable human development and really much more on sustainability as a core value that's emerged, as we've seen the urgency of the threats to the planet grow. So when I started, or let's say back in the 1990s, the idea was emerging that, what is valuable in life is not defined strictly by money. So that the UN Development Program grew out of an awareness that GDP, gross domestic product, isn't really a sufficient measurement of how well we're doing in the world, how well countries are doing vis-a-vis another. That GDP growth isn't, the only statistic we should be looking at. So at that point, UNDP was core to a movement that said, okay, let's measure other things. What other things should we measure? And so what they focused on at the time, and it's still a legacy that's very relevant to the work that I do or the work that UNDP does in Turkey and elsewhere, is what matters is a healthy life, is longevity, is knowledge, and is choices and opportunities. So there's much more than, there are all these sayings of man does not live by bread alone or by money alone, that we need to have a life that's full of opportunities, and that everyone needs to have an equal right or an equal say in those things. So at the time, UNDP invented something called the Human Development Index, where instead of measuring countries by the level of their gross domestic product or by how much that is growing each year, they put in indicators for length of schooling, educational attainment, and longevity. So as they're sort of rough indicators, but the whole idea, I think it's more important than the indicators, is that well-being means much more than just money and a whole lot more than just an average GDP per person per country. But then over time, and I think this has evolved, so we go from human development to sustainable human development because of an awareness that human activity and the quest for growth to achieve prosperity or to achieve this higher GDP was destroying the foundations of the planet. And I think this was always an environmental consciousness of the need for nature protection to protect biodiversity. But what has really driven home the importance of sustainability is climate change. And we're way beyond the time where you could debate, is there such a thing? Way beyond the time where you could debate, is this a human-driven thing? It very clearly is a thing. It very clearly is a human-driven thing. And we are arriving at a point where we say, okay, there is no planet B, as our Secretary General says. We have no other option. So if we're prosperous, if we're healthy, even if we're equal, it doesn't matter if we don't have a planet to live on. So human development has become sustainable human development, and then sustainable human development has been translated into really the core vision that UNDP and other UN agencies live by, which are the sustainable development goals that were adopted in 2015 by all the member states of the United Nations. So I'm sure you're familiar with them. These are the 17 global goals that range from no hunger to good education, to eliminating all violence against women and girls, to protecting life above, life on land, life below water, stopping the impact of climate change. These 17 goals were adopted by everybody, and we should emphasize that it's not a UN agenda. This is an agenda that was voluntarily accepted by every country that is a member state of the United Nations. And we see, even in that context, so that was 2015 with the target of achieving these goals by 2030, is that the importance of some of those goals have started to seem much more crucial. It's not that anyone is more important than the other, but that if we don't achieve, say, Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which is dedicated to climate action, we won't have an opportunity to address the other ones. And so for UNDP, the emphasis, especially in terms of advocacy of what we are trying to persuade the world, is the need to find a model for growth, the need to find a model for prosperity, the need to find a path to well-being that doesn't depend on destroying natural resources. So this goes well beyond climate. This is, the whole idea that nature, we are part of nature, and that nature isn't something that we subdue or use. It's that we are very much an element of nature, and we need to heed its laws and limits. So that's on the first question. I think you can see that sustainability is now the core challenge and the core goal that we need to strive for together. So then turning to the United Nations, which as you know, I've worked now for 17 years for the UN, for the development program, but the UN, to say one thing, the UN is profoundly an intergovernmental body, so that, when I say I work for a UN organization, but the UN is not separate from the world's governments. It is kind of a sum total of the world's governments. And the principle there is that each country has an equal voice. It's not actually true in areas like the Security Council, and President Erdogan is very clear on the world is more than the five members, the five veto holding members of the Security Council. But I think the principle applies that the UN I think it is more than the sum of its parts in some ways, but it is a body that really can't do anything that's beyond the will of its constituent parts. I think that's important to remember, that the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, they are not something that UNDP invented as a UN agency, but they're something that were adopted through painstaking work by every member state of the United Nations. As I think you probably know from your own educations, the UN rests on three different pillars. So one is peace and security, and that's where the idea is that the UN should be able to step in and resolve conflicts, but also prevent them from happening. So the track record there is a bit mixed. We have to admit. The second pillar is human rights, where I think the UN does a very good job of establishing standards, is less powerful in holding countries to account on their human rights record. And the third pillar is development, which is where which is where I sit. And we can talk more if you're interested in the question and answers, I think, about what UNDP does in Turkey. But just to give you an example, because as I said, I'm in a car on my way back from Gebze, where we were marking achievements of a project dedicated to replacing old engines in Turkish industry with energy efficient engines. And that project is based on the research that showed that these outmoded engines that are core to any industrial process, that they emit a lot of bad greenhouse gases and they cost a lot of fuel for companies. So if they can be replaced by something that's energy efficient and less of an emitter of greenhouse gases, that industries will save money and be more competitive, but also that they will be closer to a green model of growth. So it's a very nitty-gritty thing. This is what UNDP does, but it translates the ideals of the Sustainable Development Goals into changes, sometimes small, sometimes larger, that promote the achievement of those goals. The UN, as I said, it's the sum of its parts, and even where the human rights conventions that come out of the UN are legally binding treaties that have the force of international law, the UN doesn't have an enforcement mechanism that's any stronger than voluntary compliance by member states. So that's important to remember. But then somehow the UN, I think, is able to generate ideals, goals, and value systems that are somehow better than that sum of the parts, so that can be a vision of our better selves. And you can see this in areas like gender equality, where the UN has very, very high standards that aren't often met by member states. Human rights, I also mentioned. But then what's very relevant for our topic today is being a forum for issues that don't respect borders. So those are very much on our minds today, because we have not only climate change, which I think we suffer very much because, the consequences spread around the world, and it's very unfair that the countries that have produced the most carbon emissions are not the countries that suffer the impact of climate change, and especially the impact of the climate-driven disasters that now we're seeing so much. So we have climate change, but then we also have pandemic. Pandemic is another one where you see how quickly these variants spread. We need a global governance structure. The UN is trying to be the global governance structure in both of these areas. There are some positives, I think, but there are also some limitations. But let me then move on to, really what I think is the core of our discussion today, which is, are we doomed? Is climate change going to, cause our extinction as a species? And in advance of the climate summit in Glasgow, UNDP produced what I thought was a very appealing video, which I can share the link with you later if you haven't seen it, where a dinosaur, a 60 million year old dinosaur, marches into the General Assembly plenary session and gives a speech about, at least we had the excuse of asteroids, that dinosaurs were driven extinct by asteroids, but what are you people doing? You're subsidizing fossil fuels that are generating the greenhouse gases that are causing the climate change that risks the fate of the planet. So the hashtag for that video is "Don't Choose Extinction." So this is I think the existential question that these negotiations were around. They were very, in some ways, I think we'll hear from someone who was actually there, but they can be very grindingly detail-oriented, very not, spectacularly interesting, but they are the key to reaching an agreement that can help save us from extinction. In terms of was it a success? Was it a failure? It really depends on your expectations, I think, for Glasgow. And there were some very high expectations from the UN side, from the side of the organizers, from the side of climate activists, in the sense that, as our Secretary General said, this is like 11:59 on the 12 on the clock. It is we are running out of time. We need to move. And his focus going in was really on coal as the worst contributor to carbon emissions, and something where there was the hope that there could be an agreement to eliminate new coal-fired power plants this year, new ones, and then eliminate them entirely by 2040 and eliminate them for the big coal producers by 2030. So expectations were high. Did we get there? Well, not exactly, and I think there's some positives. So in the positives, we had a lot of countries promising to achieve a net zero target by 2050, or in Turkey's case, 2053. So that means to achieve a reality where the country emits on balance zero carbon emissions, so zero greenhouse gases. At the beginning of 2020, 30% of the world's GDP, so 30% of the world's economy, was covered by a government that said we commit to net zero. And by Glasgow, so by November 2021, that share was 90%. And that includes Turkey, which we know Turkey waited a long time to ratify the Paris Agreement. But then when Turkey did ratify finally, ahead of Glasgow, it came also with a commitment to achieve net zero by 2053. So that should be really good news for us all. That should make us optimistic. And there was also some optimism building agreements reached on the sides of on the margins of Glasgow. So agreements to dramatically reduce the level of methane gases, which are very, very bad actors in climate. There was a big agreement on adopting net zero goals for the world's financial industry, so covering $140 trillion in assets. There was a very positive agreement on halting deforestation and restoring the world's forests, to which Turkey was also a party. There was an agreement to eliminate internal combustion engine-driven cars in many countries and by many automakers very soon. There were some countries that committed to halting use of coal, and some that committed to halting new exploitation of oil and gas reserves. There was a lot of new money devoted to adaptation. So mitigation is halting or reducing the carbon emissions that cause climate change, and adaptation is helping countries prepare for the impact of climate change. It's like we're seeing very clearly giant floods, giant forest fires, tornadoes, the sort of this nightmare world of new climate-driven disasters. So there's a lot of money going into helping countries get ready. And then I think there was a lot of activities around financial commitments to show that the world believes in the idea of solidarity, that the countries that did not contribute to creating climate change shouldn't suffer the consequences. So that's the positive bit. But to me, I really think the outcome is more one we should be alarmed about than we should be reassured by. And we saw this in many ways. We saw at the last minute, this idea that the language of Glasgow would include the concept of phasing out coal and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. At the last minute, China and India came in and we have phasing down coal, which, what does that mean? Phasing down rather than phasing out. And this is what the factor that drove to tears, almost to tears, the president of the climate summit, because really the organizers had put their heart and soul behind getting a commitment on coal. But then I think even more worrying is if you look at the reality on the ground of what's happening with the use of fossil fuels, the production of fossil fuels, and the production of emissions, we see you have on the one hand a promise of net zero by the middle of the century, but then you have everything else headed in the wrong direction. So you have coal consumption still rising, not declining, not stagnating, but going up. You have fossil fuel production by the big fossil fuel producers at double the level we would need to stick under a 1.5 degree rise. We have emissions. Emissions should have fallen by, we should have commitments to have emissions fall by half by 2030 in order to stay on target. Do we have that? No. Do we have close to that? No. We have, by some estimations, still a rise of 16% by 2030. So not going down, but going up, even though countries were encouraged and many said we're coming to Glasgow with bigger commitments. And then on top of that, we have from the UN Secretary General this disappointment that countries are a bit playing with their numbers, so that what emerged was what he called a deep and real credibility gap between the promises and even the pledges under these nationally defined contributions that you can't really have confidence that what countries say is going to happen is going to happen. So how you react to that depends on who you are. So Greta Thunberg, the most famous, probably climate activist of your generation also, said, they even succeeded in watering down the blah, 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 which is quite an achievement. So, really a damning criticism from somebody who's very close to the issues. I think even the more optimistic actors tend to be governments, but also UN agency heads who realize that maybe the expectations were a bit too high for the reality. Is that you come out of Glasgow with this idea of 1.5 degrees is still alive, but barely breathing. Or as my own boss, Achim Steiner, said, is the pulse is very weak on 1.5 degrees. So one good thing that did happen in Glasgow was an agreement by all the countries there is, okay, we need to do better. Let's regroup next year at COP27, which will take place in Cairo in Egypt. And let's do our best to come back with credible commitments and more specific action plans to get us to this net zero. So that, to me, is it good? Is it bad? I've seen lots of people argue that, well, on balance, it's not the worst outcome. But I do think that, we are seeing a gap between the verbal commitments, the rhetoric, and the reality of really just the basics of who is using how much fossil fuels, that it's hard to see how that gap will be closed. And you see around you, I'm sure if you read the newspapers, you follow the news online, we don't have time to lose because we see things happening much faster in a bad way than anyone ever expected. So in Turkey, we've together lived through a summer of like a horror movie with forest fires that just wouldn't stop in these really valuable pine forests. We saw huge flash floods along the Black Sea coast where people said, look, we've had floods before, but we've never seen torrential rain of this magnitude. We've never seen, sort of violent streams rushing at the pace that they did. In just this week in the news, there was a story about a verification of a 38-degree temperature above the Arctic Circle in Siberia. So something's wrong there. If you have, what they called furnace-like conditions where we would expect always to have ice and snow. And then, as an American, I was watching in horror these tornadoes that we saw last week in the United States, in Kentucky and other states, where it's not just that tornadoes happen in places where people aren't accustomed to them. It's that they were like giant tornadoes. They were tornadoes of a type and a scale and thus a death toll that people have never seen. So really, to me, the symptoms are all there that we really have pushed the planet too far. We are running out of time and we need to get our act together if we have any hope of the sustainability being a concept that we can consider realize. So just then to turn over, I know part of the discussion that you wanted to have is, okay, what can you do as a school, as young people, as making choices in life? And here I would just say, I think a lot of, say, the initial response to climate change, especially by, say, big businesses, was to kind of try to deflect the pressure onto individuals. So to say, okay, you should be using a tote bag, you should be drinking water out of a glass receptacle that you can reuse rather than plastic, that you should compost, maybe become a vegetarian. I'm a vegetarian, everything helps. But to me, this is true. You can do a lot. You can contribute a lot. You can ride a bike instead of driving a car. But to me, the real answer is going to be that individual changes in behavior, but also political activism, mobilizing to demand from those who do hold the decision-making power to make decisions that are in the interest of your future and in everybody's future. And so those are two quite different actions, but I think they are both, within reach to you as young people, and obviously voting is a big part of it in every society. But I think it's this combination of understanding where the threats are and then demanding action from the political leaders who represent you. Because without that, I think we will just see a kind of continued selfishness on the part of particularly the wealthier countries to continue doing what they have been doing, And we see that the disastrous impact is coming faster than I think anyone predicted. So it's not something for future generations, but it's something hitting us right now. So with that, thank you very much for hearing me out and listening. I hope I've sort of prepared the ground for a good discussion on sustainability. And you've heard from the UNDP side what it means to us, but I'm really curious to hear from you what it means to you, and especially curious to hear from someone who was actually there in Glasgow, your impressions. So thanks so much for this opportunity, and looking forward to a good discussion.
Thank you, Louisa. Next, we'll hear from Hazal about her experience at COP26.
So, hi everyone. As you know, I'm Hazal, and I want to say that first of all, I don't want to take up too much time because I want to leave some time for the Q&A session. And I'm not normally a public speaker. That's not something that's usually in my comfort zone. But I feel like when it comes to the climate crisis, which is probably the greatest threat that is facing the world right now, I feel like this sense of obligation to speak. And that's why I do these types of things. I'm very honored to be here today. So I was privileged to be offered an observer badge from the organization Global Youth Development Institute to attend the 26th Conference of the Parties. And I just want to note that this NGO focuses primarily on climate education and training, and working towards creating spaces where young people are leading the change instead of being on the sidelines. And I do look forward to continuing my work with them in the future. And just to touch on something that Ms. Vinton also talked about, is that while we were preparing for COP26 as the GYDI delegation, we had some discussions about how consensus is the thing that's kind of that guides UN negotiations. And I know you talked about how it's more of like the will of the countries rather than the UN having its own set goals for what should be done. Like there are goals, but countries determine their own national action plans and that sort of thing. And so it really is based on consensus. And so I think within all of our countries, we have an obligation to speak up and push politically for the change that we want to see. And while COP26 had many historic results, there seems to be a consensus that it failed to prioritize the voices of marginalized folk, which is why I feel quite ambivalent on the question of whether or not COP26 was a success. I want to start with some positives first. So first and foremost, I think that COP26 had many benefits for climate activists, mainly because we got to connect in a physical space and be in solidarity with one another. I've spent around 1.5 years mainly doing online activism, going to meetings and that sort of thing. So being in a space where we were actually able to have in-person meetings and I got to see my friends face to face, I think that was quite empowering, and we saw just how large the climate movement is. And so for context, within the COP26 venue, there was this building of pavilions, which are essentially like rooms where different countries and organizations get to hold events and provide relevant content. And Turkey had a pavilion as well. And I would say that connecting to like the whole question of like being in solidarity with one another and getting to see each other face to face, this was by far my favorite part of the conference, because I got to connect with US climate organizers in the Action for the Climate Emergency Pavilion. I got to talk to youth activists in the Ghana Pavilion. I got to engage with scientists from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the World Meteorological Organization, Fundación MERI, and the Met Office, and this was in the Science Pavilion. So in that sense, I think that COP26 provided an atmosphere for networking, and it was incredible to meet so many people who were each working on tackling the climate crisis, given their respective interests and capabilities. However, that doesn't mean that there weren't negatives as well, which Ms. Vinton also talked about. So on the negative side, I think the thing that was most apparent to me was that there was a huge lack of transparency that prevented people who were attending for the first time from fully participating in the events. So it was difficult to get accurate information on what negotiation sessions were going on at a single moment. There were very few maps in the menu. And some sessions, particularly the plenary sessions, were only open to certain people, despite the fact that the whole purpose of having an observer badge as an NGO is being able to observe policymaking. And I, just as an anecdote, I remember my friend and I were trying to find something called Bilateral Meeting Room 6. And we spent 20 minutes looking for this room. It wasn't on any maps. We asked a bunch of first aid people. We asked different security guards where it was, and none of them had any clue. And so it was a mess in that sense. And I know that these may seem like trivial comments, but I think that organizational issues are what actively prevent civil society from engaging in the conferences in a constructive manner. And I hope that in COP27 and COP28 and the following COPs that we see this change. I still believe that youth had a critical impact in terms of bringing justice to the agenda, both within and outside the conference. I had a friend who conducted interviews with UNICEF. I had a friend who gave an amazing workshop on the socio and psycholinguistics of how we frame the climate crisis. I had friends that gave speeches at the different protests that were held. And in fact, I want to add that one of these protests was attended by, I believe there are different numbers, but most of them say over 120,000 people. And this is just one indicator that climate justice has widespread support from the public. In fact, I was actually stewarding in that protest, and I remember it was incredibly cold, it was rainy. My friends and I were miserable, but we looked around us and the sun was coming up and there was a rainbow, and we were seeing all the people cheering on the sidelines and walking with us. And I think that was right after the first week of COP. That gave me quite a lot of hope. And I'm so glad that I got to see in person, physically, just how much support the climate movement has. At the end of the 2 weeks, a great deal was accomplished at COP26. And of these outcomes, I believe that gender equity, emissions reductions, and climate education are crucial to look at. Some of these things Ms. Vinton has already touched on, but I'll just add a few notes. So first of all, depending on how much reading you've done, I know that gender and climate may seem unrelated at first. I know that when I was first looking into the issue, they didn't seem too connected, but there are actually lots of studies that have established that women, particularly within the Global South, and for those who don't know, Global South is a term that refers to usually developing countries. Women in Global South nations face the impacts of climate change to a greater extent, and women are at a higher risk of being displaced due to natural disasters, and their work in agriculture is more likely to be disrupted due to the combined impact of the climate crisis and societal gender roles. And in COP26, many countries pledged to dedicate more funding for women farmers in the Global South. And besides that, there were more commitments towards developing gender-sensitive, nationally determined contributions. I remember Ms. Vinton mentioning nationally determined contributions. I can't remember if she defined it or not, but just to explain, basically nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as they're called, are climate change action plans that each country who's ratified the Paris Agreement is required to create in line with the principles of the Paris Agreement. So Turkey currently does not have an official NDC. It has an intended nationally determined contribution. But under this, you will see different emissions reduction targets and what that means for each sector, like agriculture and that sort of thing. Another thing that caught my attention when going over articles about COP26 was that Turkey had the second highest number of country delegates behind Brazil, and 284 of these delegates were men, whereas only 92 were women. This means that women comprised less than a quarter of Turkey's total delegates, and I think it's clear that we have to have better representation for this if we want to actually achieve more gender-sensitive, nationally determined contributions. And Ms. Vinton touched on this, but under emissions reductions targets, I think it is suffice to say that not enough was done with regards to regulatory policies. Commitments from COP26 put us towards around 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming. And this is despite the fact that past IPCC reports have already established that 1.5 degrees is the highest temperature we should be limiting ourselves to. And the UK government has also emphasized Its role for the conference was urgently to keep the 1.5 goal alive. And again, I just want to add here that 1.5 degrees is not still a safe number. It's also bound to have drastic consequences across the globe. Right now, we're around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees, and we're already seeing typhoons. There's a typhoon hitting the Philippines right now. There are floods in northern Iraq, and then there were the tornadoes in the Midwest. So we're seeing all of these natural disasters, and so 1.5 degrees is not, the safe limit. It's just that scientifically and politically speaking, it is what is feasible and what is much less likely to bring out tipping points that will further worsen the crisis we're in. And since this event is taking place in the context of a school environment, I implore everyone to take a look at the Glasgow Work Programme, which provides a framework for countries to develop their own plans regarding education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information in relation to the climate crisis. I'd like to end by emphasizing that climate policies cannot leave marginalized and most impacted groups behind. That means when we advocate for climate justice, we advocate for workers' rights, gender equity, racial equity, disabled rights, trans rights, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazal. Now we'll move on to our question and answer panel. Last week, we asked Hisar students and staff what they wanted to hear more about. On today's panel, we will have a chance to pose some of those questions to Louisa Benton. Hazal, I think you'll begin.
Great. So again, since this is taking place in the context of a school, our first question we want to start off with, how can the education system contribute to sustainability, and how can one define a sustainable school?
So I think first and foremost, the gaining knowledge and understanding the challenges and then the solutions is really, I think, a core challenge for a school. And there's been so much disrespect for science as a value in pandemic and in climate change, and you still find people spreading just nonsense views, but those views gaining traction. And I think education, serious education, critical thinking are key. And I think the school is where you develop the faculties for critical thinking. So that would be first and foremost to ensure that the school curriculum includes, an understanding of what climate change means. Going through, as Hazal, I think you should have my job. I'm ready to retire. Please take over. But in the way that you did, to explain what this different terminology means, what the implications are, and then to look at the solutions. Because I think in some cases we know the solutions. We know certainly what causes the climate change, but some of the solutions that we need to figure out, for example, we need to have, I think Hazal was getting to this point, this idea of a just transition, that, okay, if we're going to phase out coal, we have a big industry. We have lots of people who work as coal miners, for example. So they need to see a path to their future. They need to see, there needs to be some vision, but also a credible plan for what they and their families and their communities, often their sort of mono-industry communities in the world. So that idea of just to get people enthusiastic about providing the answers to the challenges that climate change is going to bring, and they'll be with us for decades, if not forever. So that's the first thing, is just the school curriculum, the school approach, and then developing the critical thinking to separate the nonsense. And this goes to pandemic too, and vaccines and all this, where, vaccine doesn't make your arm magnetic, things like that. Anyway, but then in terms of having a sustainable school, yeah, I think that there's a lot that can be done. It's just being able to look and say, okay, where are we part of the problem and how can we contribute to the solution? So there's obviously recycling of waste, and also this new principle that's going way beyond recycling, which is, not to generate whatever it is in the first place. So reuse, reduce, recycle, but really to be responsible consumers and producers means, there's some things that you just don't need in life, and understanding which, I think it's partly going back to the first point, to me, I was I remember somebody came to me and said, okay, we can't, for lots of our projects, we have, conferences where you give something to people so they remember the messages of the conference. And it's also a sense, okay, here's a goodie that you get. And so many of those are plastic. And I remember having a discussion with my team member I said, well, okay, but if we're going to give people water bottles, surely that's environmental. But you need to look further, because if it's a plastic manufactured water bottle, then you're contributing to this problem of plastics, that the production of plastics is a disaster in every respect. So anyway, it's understanding the components of the problem, but then coming up with policies to deal with it. So that then I would say there's lots that can be done. You can compost, you can bicycle instead of driving, you can look, I think, first and foremost at energy efficiency, because I think this in Turkey is something that's completely underappreciated, that you can if you don't use the energy at all, that's the best solution. So if you can look into energy efficient, if you can look into better insulation, better windows, but also put solar panels on the roof to generate your own power, there are lots of ways to go. And then the third avenue, I think, is really organizing. It's the point that I was making, is that it's not going to be enough just to have a school. Your school doesn't live in a bubble, and you are a victim of, but also contributor to broader trends. And there, I think it's, mobilizing, through organizations like the one that I think Hazal was selected by to go to Glasgow. Organize, make sure your voice is heard. If people say you're young, we don't need to listen to you, you insist, and be very, very loud. Because I think now is not a time to be quiet. It's really a time to be loud. And I agree with Hazal completely. This 120,000 people who took to the streets in a cold, wet day, I think it surprised everybody, but it shows the appetite for, the appetite of people to fix this problem. I know I have a 25-year-old son, and this is his core concern in life, is climate. It's that, this is a looming disaster, a very personal disaster. And it's a violation of your generation's human rights to choose and to live your lives in a way that could be considered, taking advantage of all the rights and opportunities you should have. So I would focus on those three things for sustainable schools.
Thank you. Before we continue, I wanted to add that anybody who is in class right now is free to ask questions. You can type them into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will be fielding them as they come. Okay, our second question today is, where are we on our sustainability journey? And I mean we in the broad sense of we.
Yeah, I think this is a key one, because I think we've already, we've gone way too far. We're consuming too many planets already at the current rate. So I think it's important not to, I think we can't overstate the ambition of the targets that we need. We need to change our way of life. I think there's no other way. And I think this is the danger we face, is that the people who are making the decisions, they're also the people who are, like my generation, I will see the disasters, but I won't see the mega disaster maybe that's coming. And so that there's this disproportion between the interests of the people making decisions and the people who are affected by the decisions. But I think when we start to think about, we need dramatic solutions, far-reaching solutions, but they can be quite exciting ones. And I think if we think about our experience in the pandemic, that we've come out of it, I think all of us appreciate nature much more, that nature is an absolute good. So that if you think about, what if we could restore some kind of balance? So then I think it's much easier then to think about things like green jobs, and that you could have a whole industry devoted to restoring ecosystems. That could be an entire, a new occupation, or decarbonizers. That if you're looking for an occupation of the future, to say, I would like to become a decarbonizer. I will show industry how to stop emitting carbon altogether. So I think we can be excited about the solution, but I think we've pushed the limits too far. The pandemic is a sign of it. The disasters are a sign of it. So we need very, very radical solutions that many people will find disturbing or upsetting because it's a challenge to an accepted way of life. But it's clear we can't go on as we have. It's clear to lots of people. I think it's not clear to everybody. So there are still powerful forces trying to just to say, please let me go back to normal, especially after pandemic. I just want to go back to the way things were. So again, we come back to raising voices and insisting that this is a generational question as well, that the limits have been exceeded and we need to find a more circular lifestyle, a more, one that doesn't destroy additional natural resources to sustain it.
Thank you so much. I want to add, there are a couple of questions that just came in from different classes who are watching. Two of them are about the target dates of 2030 and Turkey's date of 2053. And the questions are, isn't it too late for targets like 2053 with other ecological disasters, is 2030 too late a date to put on the changes that we're planning for?
I think the problem is not one of the timeline. It's one of the credibility of the commitment to the action needed to achieve the results by that timeline. So you have lots of countries saying 2050, Turkey saying 2053 for historical reasons. But I think the challenge for Turkey is that the target has been set, but now, there needs to be a credible definition of the policies and practices to get there. And this is something yesterday, UNDP opened together with the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization, and Climate Change, now renamed to reflect the challenge of climate change, a process to do the strategy for 2050 and the action plan for 2030, which will include refining the NDCs, which is really a crucial part of it. The challenge here is really that to make that 2050 target credible, the questions that will have to be asked are very difficult ones for Turkey, like coal, because people who speak on behalf of, say, the Ministry of Environment in Turkey say, look, we have already 52% of installed capacity is renewable energy. But then you say, okay, what's the rest? And the rest is fossil fuels, and that there are plans to expand production of coal. So the question needs to come very early on the agenda here. Is the country prepared to make politically difficult decisions to reduce or eliminate entirely reliance on fossil fuels? And in that, the coal that Turkey uses is the very worst kind of coal, lignite coal, that generates the very worst kind of emissions. So the time horizon depends on what you think is the appetite for difficult choices in Turkey at the moment. So I think it's very contextual. So for some places, 2050, I think it's still a very credible horizon that decision can be taken. 2030 is a tough one, but I think there can be a productive impact of, okay, say countries come back together next year in Cairo. If there is an increased sense of solidarity that the wealthier economies will be helping the less wealthy economies to adopt more ambitious targets, then maybe we have a chance. But yeah, I have to say, I'm not optimistic on this score. I think we have to do everything we can to make it possible. But it's very good that the net zero is set as a target, but then there needs to be a concerted effort to devise the very, very ambitious policies that would be needed to make that a realistic deadline. So I think the question is a very, very good one. It is where the weakness is. Is there enough time to adopt and take the difficult decisions that will be necessary to make that a realistic target?
Okay, I think our next question will be from Hazal.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to quickly add that it's definitely, when you were talking about how it's a matter of sticking to our goals, I think that's really important, because when we, like with the 2030 deforestation pledge, I mean, there have been many pledges for stopping deforestation before. It's just a matter of whether countries are going to stick to their promises and finally put the planet and people over profits. So the next question, which may be related to maybe like energy transitions and that sort of thing, is that technology has the potential to pave the way for sustainable futures, but yet it is often used in a negative way. What must be done to end this and make sure that technology is used for good?
Wow. Well, yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes we tend to overestimate the value of technology versus what you're saying. I think really it's the political will and social consensus that's important. And then I think the technology can be used either way, for good or for bad. I think in some cases technology can help us reduce emissions by enhancing efficiency and whatever. You can use digital technology. We are seeing, I don't know, how you can use drones to deliver emergency supplies to people who are isolated in emergencies rather than having to actually physically get there. So I think there's no sort of moral value of technology inherent in technology. It's really the decisions that society is making. But I do think that we should count on human ingenuity to help us leapfrog some challenges, and then also I think we need to take stock ourselves of what's important. That I think the pandemic is a disaster in a lot of ways, but I think it has been a spur to reflection on what's important in life, and that I think the idea that we need to continually grow and grow and grow in order for people to be happy is a bit of a myth. So maybe that technology is sometimes seen as the necessary ingredient in making a life better or more convenient. And I think part of the key to the future is rethinking those assumptions altogether and saying let's decide on what's important, and then let's make a commitment to stop destroying resources to get there. So it's not really a direct answer to your question, but I think the key is not in the technology itself, but in the social consensus and the political will to ensure that we don't undermine our own chance at a future.
Great. The next question is about activism. And is activism enough? Is it effective in finding solutions?
Activism is not going to be enough, but I think activism tied to the political process is the key. So it's there are a lot of, the world has a lot of different political systems, and decisions are made, with lesser or more engagement of the people who are affected by those decisions. And very much it's a core principle of UNEP, core principle of UN, that, nothing about us without us should be the way that decisions are made, that you do not, that there is no sort of hyper-centralized political will on making decisions. So I think that, activists need to focus not just on mobilizing communities, but on, ensuring that decision makers hear them. And that's not easy in many societies. And, but I think it's key that one way or another, the political leaders who make decisions, who make the commitments on behalf of countries, need to understand that there's a price to be paid if the voice, the consensus that we need to protect our planet is not heard. And then I think, I put a lot of store in broad coalitions of interest. So I think, one thing I see in Turkey is that the most progressive, I think, policies on, say, European Green Deal. So European Green Deal is the EU saying, we don't want to allow competition from products produced outside the EU that don't adhere to our stricter rules on carbon content, on climate change, so that they will have a mechanism that will impose heavy tariffs on goods that are made with a high carbon content. And so you have a big Turkey exports a lot to the EU. You have a big industry that's devoted to exporting to the EU. So people in business are thinking way ahead on this, how to adapt, how to ensure that this is a competitive advantage rather than a risk to industry. So my point would be, okay, activism, but activism also to build partnerships with other interested forces to make sure that there's a big coalition, and a coalition that includes all sorts of different actors to whom any political leader or political decision maker has to listen.
As a follow-up to that, I'm curious, Hazal, as an activist, if you have anything you'd like to add about activism.
Yeah, of course. So I don't think the answer to this is necessarily, activism is effective or activism isn't effective. I think it depends largely on the situation and the different factors at hand. And related to this, I'd like to mention the Stop Cambo campaign that was mainly organized within the United Kingdom. So for those who don't know, essentially there's a Cambo oil field off the coast of, I think, the Shetland archipelago connected to Scotland. I'm not too sure about the details since I'm not personally involved. But in the North Sea, there is an oil field, and mainly Shell and Siccar Point Energy were the two stakeholders who were aiming to develop this oil field. And after different petitions and emailing their politicians and attending protests, about, I think, 2 weeks ago, Shell actually withdrew from the oil field. So it had like a 30% ownership, and it withdrew from the ownership and no longer will be connected to the project. And because of that, largely because they're not able to carry this out by themselves, Siccar Point Energy just about 6-7 days ago also put a pause to the Cambo oil field project. And so I think that's just one example of how activism can be effective. And that's not to say that activism was the only factor at play here. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons. Shell personally named an economic basis for why it was pulling out of the project. But I think that activism did definitely play a role in this, and the public pressure towards institutions and fossil fuel companies was definitely impactful in getting Shell to pull out of the oil field. I also want to say that I think activism is quite a broad term. It can encompass a lot of different things. Some people, in terms of accessibility, find social media activism more accessible, and maybe they'll make videos or do live streams or make certain posts about a topic. Whereas other people may, particularly in countries where there isn't a crackdown on democracy or it's less authoritarian, are able to freely engage in the freedom of assembly and attend protests and that sort of thing. So the way that activism functions changes from country to country. So I think it depends particularly on the different, again, factors at hand. And I also think that there's the whole question of whether performative activism is helpful and to what extent social media activism is performative activism. There's sociologists who are studying, the theory of social movements who are much more knowledgeable about this than I am. But I think that, again, because it's such a broad term, it largely depends on what sort of activism is being done. And does it have a political impact? Is there a political correspondence to that? Yeah, that's what I would like to add. Thank you.
Thank you again, Louisa and Hazal. This concludes our panel. Today, we heard about the way that all our future goals hinge on the larger issue of the climate crisis and how we approach sustainable development. If there's a takeaway, it is that we can all make conscious decisions to live more ecologically sustainable lives, but we also need to put serious pressure on the people in positions of power to make their decisions conscientiously, to put the planet over profit, and to not choose extinction. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me. And Hazal, it's been nice to meet you virtually in this way. Also, Ned, thank you so much.
Yes, it was amazing to meet you as well.
Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, really. I hope it was helpful. And yeah, let's hope we can change something. Small scale, large scale change would be good. So, thanks.